What we're going to be going over here is job order costing for a manufacturing operation, and what we're going to be concentrating on is this manufacturing overhead account here, and this is where we accumulate our indirect costs here on these products or on these jobs that are going through the factory. So we're going to accumulate all those indirect costs here, and we're going to know what their actual indirect amount is, or the actual indirect costs are at the end of the period. But while this product is going through the factory, or these jobs are going through the factory, we're going to apply some budgeted or a predetermined overhead rate or an applied rate here for those jobs that are going through the factory here. And we're doing that in order to get the costing as the job moves through the factory. We don't have our actual costs until the end of the period, but we want to get our applied or our estimated cost on these products as they flow through the factory. So what we're going to do here in this manufacturing overhead account, we're going to, based on our applied overhead rate here, we're going to have a indirect cost or an overhead cost that we're going to apply to the product, and it's going to flow into the work in process inventory account at that applied manufacturing overhead rate, at the applied manufacturing overhead rates. And this would be normal costing for job order costing. So what we're going to have to do here for this manufacturing overhead or indirect costs, first thing we have to do, we have to determine our cost allocation basis for our overhead rates here. And this is the key here. There's a whole bunch. This product can be going through any number of different departments in the factory, and like finishing departments, machining departments, painting departments, and each of them may have a different cost allocation basis of some sort. And what we mean by cost allocation basis, this is where it's either based on, going down here, direct labor hours, machine hours, or what have you. You're going to have to come up with some allocation basis. So then the next thing we have to do, we have to determine what is included here based on our cost allocation basis and the department that these products are going through. So we're going to have to determine what indirect costs are included here. And then thirdly, we're going to have to calculate that overhead or that applied manufacturing overhead rate. And mind you, there's any number of different overhead rates that you'd be calculating. For each different department in the factory, you'd have a different overhead rate. So we're just going to follow through the procedure here for one overhead rate, and it's going to actually be based on direct labor hours here. So what we have to do for our cost allocation, we have to first determine our cost allocation basis for this, and we're going to do it for one overhead rate here. And you would do the same, follow the same procedures through for any number of different overhead rates, depending on what department it's flowing through. And then what's included, those would be the associated indirect costs, and then how to calculate it, that's going to be the rate per unit that we have here. In this case, a rate per direct labor hour that we're going to be calculating. So for our manufacturing overhead, it's going to include both a variable overhead and a fixed overhead here for those indirect costs. We're going to have both of those. We're going to look at both our variable and our fixed components. So first off, let's just go and see what's going into this manufacturing overhead from the perspective here of our materials. Well, the direct materials that are used, they're going to go directly into the work in process account. But the indirect materials that are used, we're going to credit them out of our materials account, and they're going to be debited into our manufacturing overhead control account here. This is where we're going to be accumulating the actual cost here of those materials for the period that we're looking at. Just say it's for a yearly period here. So that would be for our materials. But moving down here, now let's look at our labor here. Well, this is our manufacturing payroll account, and our direct labor used, it's going to go directly into the work in process account here, directly into our inventory for our work in process here. But our indirect labor, that's going to be credited out here of our manufacturing payroll, and it's going to go into our manufacturing overhead. The actual amount here is going to be going into our manufacturing overhead account. So we got our variable and our fixed components here are really comprised of our indirect materials, our indirect labor, and all those other indirect costs that we're going to be looking at. So let's go and let's look at how we would make those calculations here. Just going through it in terms of looking at just one cost allocation basis here, and just say it's for one department here. Okay. All right. So this is where we're going to be looking. We're going to have to calculate that predetermined overhead rate that we're going to be using here or applying to our jobs here that are going through the factory. That's an applied manufacturing overhead rate. So we're going to really have two different types of overheads or indirect costs that we're going to be looking at. We're going to have the variable overhead component here, and we'll go through that, and then we're going to have that fixed overhead component here. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to determine an overhead rate for each, both the variable overhead and our fixed overhead. So let's just start with our variable overhead here, and let's just look at the associated costs. Now these would be typical costs that we'd be looking at here in a general manufacturing situation here. And again, whatever department we call them cost pools here, departments or machining centers, you'd have to go through this procedure for each of those cost pools, as they call it. So we'd have to go through it for each of those and establish an overhead rate for each of those departments. So let's just go through here, look at some typical variable overhead associated costs for a manufacturing operation. So for a variable overhead, we're going to have direct material, indirect labor, overtime premiums, repairs and maintenance items, utilities, unemployment taxes, idle time, FICA taxes, vacations and holidays, pensions, hospitalization insurance, and so forth. So those are just typical items that you're looking at. But it depends on what cost allocation basis you're doing. Now, if it was for a machine or a machining center, you'd probably have different variable items in here, depending on what it is. It depends on how you want to, what cost pool you're looking at, what department you're looking at, and so forth. Anyway, so what you would do here, just looking at our variable overhead, if we look at just starting with our indirect material here, just say, for example, we want to calculate the amount of overhead, variable overhead we'd be allocating for each of these associated costs. So just looking at our indirect material here, say for example, we budgeted here for the year, we budgeted $12,000 worth of indirect material here, and that's based on 4,800 or 4,800 direct labor hours. So we're doing all our cost allocation basis here on direct labor hours. So you divide that into 4,800 into 12,000, you're going to get a variable overhead rate here of $2.50 per hour. So for every direct labor hour we have being used in the department here, or that we're looking at, or in this particular cost pool, $2.50 is going to be allocated as indirect material. Okay, so you'd have to do that for each of the items here. Just go and do that for each of the items. So you have to calculate it for each of the components here. Just take whatever budgeted cost you have estimated for that, for like indirect labor here, whatever budgeted cost you have, that, then you have to divide it by the budgeted direct labor hours, or that cost allocation base. In this case it's 4,800. So you do that for each of those items. So what we would do here, we'd go through each of those items, we total them up here, and this is where we're going to get our total variable overhead cost here, and it happens to be $30 per direct labor hour here. So for every direct labor hour, we're going to have to charge off total variable overhead here of $30 per direct labor hour. Now, if we didn't have all these, if all we knew was our total variable costs here for the period, and let's just say they're $144,000 total variable cost, and again, we know our total direct labor hours we're using, those 4,800 hours here, 4,800 hours, you divide that out, and you're going to get a total variable overhead rate here, $30 per hour. Okay, and again, this 4,800 hours are direct labor hours here. Those are budgeted direct labor hours. Now we can also, and that's if we didn't have all these things, but you'd probably want to go through and you'd want to identify your associated costs and how much each one of those is contributing on a per direct labor hour here towards variable overhead. And then another way of looking at that, this $30 per hour, say for example, our standard direct labor cost here for the department or whatever we're looking at here, the cost pool, is say it's $15 per hour. So if we know that we have, the total variable overhead here, $30 per hour, just divide it out here, $15 into the $30 per $15 direct labor cost per hour here, divided into the $30 here total variable overhead, you're going to get 200% here. So this figure can come in handy here when all you know is the total direct labor cost in the department. You would take it times 200% here, and that would give you your total variable overhead that you'd have to apply. So that becomes a key figure here. You always, if you can figure it out in terms of percentage here, where you take your, your direct labor cost on a per hour basis divided into your variable overhead, your total variable overhead here, and then you're going to get some percentage. So that can become handy here. Okay, so we've looked at our variable overhead. Now let's go down and let's look at our fixed overhead. Again, go through the same procedure here. The associated cost for this particular cost pool that we're looking at, this one cost pool, for a fixed overhead, we typically have, like, we'll go through them here: indirect labor, repairs and maintenances, utilities, unemployment taxes, supervisors' salaries, depreciation, property insurance, property taxes, FICA taxes, vacations and holidays, pensions, and hospitalization insurance. Very much like the variable overhead component, but we're going to assign the fixed portion of it here. So the fixed portion, that's it. So we looked at many of these same items here for our variable component here, but they would vary with the amount of production we're putting out. But this fixed overhead component, that's going to be constant for the period here, regardless. So that's why we call it a fixed portion. So okay, let's just look at our indirect labor here. Again, our budgeted amount here for the year we have sitting at $24,000 that we budgeted. Again, just use those total direct labor hours that we budget here, 4,800. So that is going to give us $5 per hour here of direct labor hour that we're going to have to apply for indirect labor here, but as the fixed overhead portion here. So, okay, we've done that for first item here, and you would repeat that for each of the items here. Go through the same procedure. Take the budgeted amount divided by the budgeted total direct labor hours we have for the period, and that'll give you your budgeted amount on a per direct labor hour. So okay, so we've taken our fixed overhead components here, add them all up, and then you're going to go through them all, add them up, and our total fixed overhead in this case is going to be $50 per hour here. Again, if we didn't know all these numbers here, we could just take and look at it as our total fixed cost. Take our total fixed cost. Now remember, that is fixed for the period here, again divided by our total direct labor hours. So our total fixed cost for this example, we got $240,000 here in fixed cost. Again, total direct labor hours at 4,800 hours. So that's going to give us that $50 per hour total fixed overhead. So for each direct labor hour on this for these jobs here, $50 here has to be charged off as fixed overhead. Again, looking at it as a percentage, you just take the $50 here per hour, and again, let's just assume there's $15 here direct cost hour per hour here on direct labor hour. That's the estimated hours. So that's going to give you 333%. So if you know your total direct labor cost, then take it times 333%, and that's going to give you your total allocation of your fixed overhead rate. Okay, so we got our total fixed overhead sitting at $50 here. So our total overhead rate per direct labor hour happens to be $80. That is our fixed overhead rate that we calculated here at $30. Our variable overhead rate here at $30 plus our fixed overhead rate here at $50. So total amount here is $80 per hour for our overhead cost here for this particular cost pool, and the basis for this cost pool, or overall, just this one overall overhead rate here we had at 4,800 direct labor hours. So it's based on the allocation basis is based on direct labor hours. Okay, so that's how you go about making your calculations here. We can just go up here one more time here. So again, the variable overhead we calculated we have to go through we have to determine each of our, the associated costs for the particular cost pool that we're looking at here, a particular department. And we determine our total amount here. Now, again, remember this is a variable amount, so it varies with the number or the output of the product that we're going, or our jobs that are going through there. If we got less jobs, we're applying less total variable overhead. So many of the same items that we have in our fixed overhead account. But let's move down to that fixed overhead. Again, many of the same items that we have in our variable overhead, but this is the fact that they're fixed. They're fixed for the period. We're going to have to pay them at this total $4,800 worth of direct labor that we're estimating at. So we're just saying those are the fixed components. But our total fixed overhead here plus our variable overhead, that's our total overhead rate for this particular cost pool or department or whatever you want. We got this one overhead right here, but you would have to go through this procedure here depending on what department. If it's say a finishing department, a machining department, or what have you, you're going to have to go through and you're going to have to determine overhead rate. I broke it down here between, again, fixed overhead and variable overhead. Now that you may not always be able to do it in those terms, but you'd have to come up with some total overhead rate on a per unit basis here and then you have to know that your allocation basis was direct labor hours. Okay, and then again, just remember you make your calculation here for each of those components just that we did. You just take your budgeted amount here that you have for the period, in this case looking at on a yearly basis, and divide it by the total direct labor, or your total in this case, your total cost allocation basis as your direct labor hours that you're looking at for the period. And that's going to give you the budgeted amount here on a per unit basis. So for each direct labor hour that's being accumulated here, you're going to have to assign so much fixed overhead. So indirect labor, in this case, we got $5 here. So for every direct labor hour, $5 has to be charged into fixed overhead as indirect labor. And if you can move down here, you can see depreciation is really high at $15 here per hour. For every direct labor hour, $15 here is going against depreciation as a fixed amount here. Okay. All right, so we've looked at our calculations here and so forth. Now let's go and let's just briefly apply this to see what we're looking at. Okay, back to our manufacturing overhead account. This is be our total fixed overhead here plus our variable overhead. So remember, our actual amounts we had in our debit account, we were accumulating our actual amounts here in our debit account. And then on our credits, this is what we were taking out of our manufacturing overhead account and moving it into the work process that predetermined or applied rate. So actually there is a little different, or our actual costs are really going to be a little bit different than what I'm showing here, but I'm just pointing out the fact here how we can use this overhead rate that we've used here to make our come up with our, really we're going to look at a budgeted fixed rate here plus a variable rate based on some actual hours. So let's just look at it. So for this fixed overhead rate here, so remember that was that fixed overhead rate, you would just take your fixed overhead rate here, $50 per hour, and the total direct labor hours here we had at 4,800 because they're fixed here. We're saying they're fixed for the period, so that's going to give us a total cost here of $240,000 for our fixed overhead. And you can look at it in terms of this percentage here. I'm just going to multiply it out. If you just knew your total direct labor here, you would just take it you take it times this 333% to get that amount. So let's just say it was that $15 per hour here. That was our labor cost on a per hourly basis here, times $4,800 here again. Total amount that we have budgeted for the period times 333%. That's going to give you $240,000. Same thing. This percentage can come in very handy here when you only know your total direct labor costs in terms of dollars, and you may not know some of these other numbers here. You can apply it in that fashion. And then moving down to, that's our fixed component. Now moving down to our variable component, this is the case where we would take the actual hours used. In this case there's 4,100 actual hours that we use of direct labor, not the 4,800, we only use 4,100, times their variable overhead rate. $30 per hour variable overhead rate, that's going to give you 123,000 here in total variable overhead costs. So okay, and then if you look at it in terms of our hourly basis, $15 per hour, again, times those 4,100 hours actually used here, times 200%. That's what we calculated. That using it on a percentage basis, you come up with 123,000 here. So your total manufacturing overhead, and based on what you have here for your budgeted amount here at your fixed overhead rate, plus your variable amount, actual use here, and your variable overhead rate is $363,000. It's a little bit different than what if we went back and we looked at our actual amounts, we would have come up with $364,000. But that's where you're going to have to make, there's going to be a spending variance in there. But I'm just showing here our calculations based on how we would use those overhead rates. And then for what we're charging out here, the applied amount, this is where the case where we're just going to take our fixed overhead rate here, our variable overhead rate here, $30 per hour, plus the fixed overhead rate here of $50 per hour, total amount here of $80 per hour, times the actual hours used here, direct labor hours of 4,100 hours, that's going to give you 328,000 that you're going to actually move out of this manufacturing overhead account here as those indirect costs, and they're going to move into the work in process. So that is our applied rate. So we went through that entire calculation up above here and to determine really the applied rate here. So that's pretty much the end of our discussion here. And well, one other thing, you're looking at this 328,000 here, you have to compare it to what you brought in here, or what you're accumulated at here, 363,000. The difference here has to be accounted for. At the end of the period, you have to make some adjustments to your accounts. You're going to have to make some adjusting entries, and the difference is going to go into, it's going to be an idle capacity variance or some of that sort. But there'll be some sort of variance here, and you're going to have to make some other calculations, and to take and bring you're going to have to bring into a line here the actual, your accounts are going to also all have to be changed such that you're using the actual overhead that you actually use for the period here. The predetermined adjustment is going to have to be made here. That's another subject, and we won't get into that here. But the only point is, I wanted to make the point here, just using those overhead rates that we calculated. Those were this fixed overhead rate, that was that predetermined or budgeted rate here, and then just looking at our total direct labor hours here. And then our variable overhead rate, again, that was what we calculated as our budgeted amount here. Okay, so that'll end our discussion.